The Titanic's real story is eventually revealed by scientists. RMS Titanic suffered a terrible accident on April 14, 1912, at 11:40 p.m., which ultimately caused its demise 3 hours later. By 2:20 a.m., on April 15, the next morning, the largest ship of its era had completely vanished beneath the ice-cold surface of the Atlantic Ocean. The Titanic took more than 1,500 lives with it, as it sank to its watery grave, which is more than two-thirds of all the passengers. We've always been taught that the ship's collision with an iceberg was what caused this terrible accident that resulted in so many fatalities. But scientists' most recent findings have refuted this idea. With an usable volume of 46,328 tons and dimensions of 882 feet, 9 inches long, 92 feet broad, and 175 feet tall, the Titanic appeared to be indestructible. In this video, we'll reveal the complete truth that has been kept secret for more than 100 years. Even the ship's officers took more than 2 weeks to learn their way around this enormous structure, which had countless corridors and decks along which people might wander for miles. The Titanic's 4 enormous smokestacks, each weighing 60 tons and rising 81.5 feet above the deck, were necessary to prevent the passengers from being covered in the soot that were blown off. To make them appear even more astounding and imposing, the smokestacks were positioned at a 30-degree angle. The expense of the ship, which was $7.5 million for construction but would have cost $166 million in 2016 due to inflation and modern currency rates, was equally inspiring. Unexpectedly, it would end up being less expensive than the $200 million that was spent on making the iconic 1997 film Titanic. Despite having a large workforce that worked 6 days a week starting at 6 o'clock in the morning, Harland and Wolff Shipyard hired 3,000 men to build the ship. Even yet, it took 26 months to finish the enormous task. Imagine working at the height of a 20-story building without safety ropes. It was challenging and dangerous, but these people needed the money to maintain their families. Although £2 a week may not seem like much, it was a competitive pay in those days. Unfortunately, 8 workers lost their lives and 246 others were hurt during building. It is therefore quite difficult to understand how such an intricate device, which required a lot of time, money, and effort to create, could have been destroyed by a single iceberg. Well, recent discoveries offer us reason to think that fire, not ice, was the catastrophe's primary cause. Sonam Maloney, a writer who has spent more than 30 years researching the fate of the Titanic, was the one to find a massive 30-foot-long black stain on the ship's hull after looking at a photograph taken before to the ship's departure. The journalist obtained a collection of never-before-seen images that documented the ship's construction as well as the preparations for both her first and final voyages. Before anyone saw it, the fire had to have been blazing at an extremely high temperature for 3 weeks. Experts in metallurgy are confident that these circumstances could have easily deteriorated the metal, diminishing its strength by as much as 75%. Because of this, the iceberg had little trouble tearing a hole in the ship's side. Without the fire, it would not have been possible, but the fact that the iceberg struck the compromised metal precisely where it did is one of the fatal Titanic's remarkable links. What if the project management was aware of the fire and that the ship shouldn't have embarked on that fateful voyage, but it would have resulted in the owners of the ship going bankrupt? The problem was that there was no coal available to power the Titanic at the time because miners were on strike throughout the nation. But tickets had already been sold out and other ships had been grounded since everyone wanted to board the biggest ship ever built. Because of this, the Titanic's owners purchased all the coal they could find, and even the request from other ships to postpone the voyage appeared unlikely. Therefore, to hide the reality, the ship was turned so that the fire markings faced away from the docks and toward the sea. As a result, the passengers couldn't see them and the voyage began. The Ritz Hotel in London served as the inspiration for the Titanic's interior design. The first-class passengers had access to a heated swimming pool, a Turkish bath, a gym, a squash court, and a beauty salon. The grand staircase descended 7 of the ship's 10 decks and was embellished with paintings, bronze cherubs, and oak paneling. Even a stylist may be ordered by women to assist them in getting dressed for dinner. The Atlantic Daily Bulletin was their onboard newspaper. Even the dogs of first-class passengers had their own area. During the journey, the animals were fed, walked, and even trained. There were 13 different courses in the first-class meals, each with its own wine. It was a large gathering that lasted for almost 5 hours. There were 1,500 bottles of wine, 20,000 bottles of beer, and 8,000 cigars. Binoculars were not present though. This discovery is noteworthy because having binoculars might have prevented the Titanic from sinking. There were no sonar equipment available at the time, which is another fatal coincidence in the string of disastrous events. Binoculars were used by special watchers to see threats in front of liners, but they were hidden away in a secret compartment on the Titanic. Second Officer David Blair, the only one with the locker key, was abruptly removed. He forgot to give the key to his replacement since he was so eager to leave the ship. Only 3 days later, once the ship was at sea, was this fatal oversight uncovered. The crew would have had just enough time to escape the collision if they had used the binoculars to spot the iceberg earlier. The crash would have also been prevented if the ship hadn't been going over the speed limit. It was unacceptable that they were running behind time since it could damage the Titanic's reputation. That is why the spacecraft was traveling at a speed that was far faster than it was intended to. In order to keep everyone on board contained, there was yet another criminal carelessness with the lifeboats. Alexander Carlisle, the Titanic's primary designer, initially intended to outfit the ship with only 48 lifeboats, but ultimately the number was decreased even further to 20. The Titanic needed roughly 60 lifeboats. Since 48 individuals made the deck appear cluttered, this was done primarily for aesthetic purposes. These 20 boats could barely fit a third of the passengers aboard the ship. Surprisingly, the laws in effect at the time allowed for such a grossly inadequate number of lifeboats. At the time the Titanic was being built, the number of boats was determined by the ship's tonnage rather than the number of passengers. On ocean liners, lifeboat exercises were regular procedures so that the crew could get the passengers ready for an emergency should it happen, but no such drill was ever conducted on the Titanic. The practice that was scheduled for the morning of the day the Titanic sank was cancelled by Captain Edward John Smith. Nobody is aware of his motivations, especially in light of the fact that other ships had been transmitting alerts about the presence of ice in the water. Perhaps this is why it took the crew longer than the usual 10 minutes to launch the lifeboats in that area. Some individuals hold Skipper Smith accountable for letting the first wave of lifeboats go just partially filled. Why weren't they all crammed on the first boat, which had 65 seats, in the first place? People didn't understand they were in serious danger since they were hesitant to leave the ship. Researchers learned in 2012 that Captain Smith had failed his initial navigation exam before passing. Who knows, though, Perhaps this contributed to the catastrophe as well. The crew of the Titanic sent out multiple distress signals as it sank, but a nearby ship, the California, disregarded the emergency flare that was launched into the sky. Following the revelation of this information, the captain of the Californian was fired. But contemporary researchers were able to establish his innocence. Better late than never, right? The Titanic's signals may have been missed because of the phenomena of light refraction. Thermal inversion occurs when layers of cold air are positioned below layers of warmer air. The light then exhibits aberrant light refraction as a result of thermal inversion. In short, all of this produces mirages, and other ships that were sailing nearby have noted them. Historian Tim Moulton is likewise certain that light refraction that night may have been the cause of the lookouts missing the iceberg. What explanation about the accident do you believe? Share your thoughts in the comments section below. Hundreds of lives were lost due to utterly criminal negligence, a tragic and unfortunate chain of coincidence, fire or ice, whatever it was.